So, just what state are the UK's armed forces in? Let's get an idea now. With me, retired Air Vice-Marshal Sean Bell. Sean, good to see you. Let's get into this, shall we? The UK not committing to spending more money on the British Army. And we heard there from Deborah Haynes, other European countries are investing more.
I think the story, we'll get the facts behind it, because defence spending you can measure in a number of different ways, but the sort of internationally recognised is a proportion of GDP. In other words, how much are you prepared to commit? NATO has set a 2% target, and all the nations within NATO have signed up to that target. The trouble is very few of them actually make it. From this graphic here, you can see that UK is up at 2.3%, but the vast majority of countries are not. What's happened is the war in Europe, which is right on the doorstep of many of our European colleagues, has suddenly shaken them all up, and they're now dramatically trying to increase spending. Germany, for example, was 1.4%. It's got a big gap to make up. Now, as a military guy, of course, I would always welcome more national money for our defences, but I have to say that the UK on this metric is paying its way. And if you look at all of this area below the graph of 2%, that is the area of spending which could make a really significant difference to NATO's capability. The other challenge is how we spend our money. We're clearly meeting the requirements of NATO. Are there smarter ways we can spend our money? Almost certainly. And that will be the use of simulation, network simulation, not just nationally but internationally, because we're going to be placing even greater reliance on alliances into the future.
So when the PM says that the UK has one of the largest defence budgets, it's because of that GDP figure that's measured by it, and the other countries are spending more to catch up. Let's talk about the British Army, because that has come into sharp focus today. The UK, it seems, allowing the British Army to shrink in the past few decades. Why, and what effect could that have going forward?
Defence, as we've heard from politicians of all parties, is the number one priority for any government. The challenge is how you spend your money, and there's no doubt the British Army, seen here training, has been reduced in size. We're heading down to 73,000, I think it is, about half the size it was 30 years ago. But, of course, the military is always configured, A, by the threat, but also by your resources. But interestingly also how we fight. And the danger is everybody's using the Ukraine war as an example of how we need to reconfigure. Russians, the way they're fighting this is almost 20th century. It's almost Neanderthal, because they have hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the ground, unguided weapons, an attritional type of warfare, almost seeming not to care about how many casualties they have. Whereas Ukraine, by contrast, which is what the West does, we tend to use technology, precision strike weapons, because we try to minimise the number of casualties we have. Now, when it comes to the size of the army, my army colleagues would say it's only the army that can take and hold ground. Absolutely right. But the nuance here is how much we rely on technology versus very, very large armies. Defence is all about choices. It's about configured to the threat, but within the resource envelope that's available. Yeah,
army personnel, just one resource. Other resources, we know that the UK has committed a lot to Ukraine, whether it's, tanks or other artillery equipment. Has that left big black holes in the UK's own defence capability when it comes to those kind of resources?
The short answer is you don't keep stuff on the shelf that you don't need. So by giving some of it away, you take increased risk. The challenge is, do you need to address that risk quickly or not? And there's been a recent report that says in the media that the government was criticised. It took almost a year to start replacing some of the equipment that's been given away. But let's use NLAWs as an example. An anti-tank weapon, over 10,000 of these have been given to Ukraine. So we need to replace them. Now, do you replace them like for like? You can't go to the shops and buy them. You have to configure industry to spin up. Or do you look and say, this thing was entered service in 2009, it was being developed 20 years ago, technology's moved on quite a pace. Could you get an upgraded model? Could you get better capability, and could it be cheaper? So undoubtedly, getting value for money for the taxpayer, MOD will have gone out and tried to find out whether there are alternatives and how best to secure those. But let's be clear, it's also not just about equipment for Ukraine, it's training as well. Literally overnight, the first batch of Ukrainian tank operators landed in the UK to try and learn how to operate the Challenger 2. There'll be both operators and maintainers. They'll be using these sorts of facilities. It's not what you'd expect a simulator to look like. There's loads and loads of tank simulators in there. There'll be lots of operators. They'll be in realistic conditions. They'll be put under a huge amount of pressure. But this is some of the best training in the world that will be provided to our Ukrainian soldiers. OK, Sean, thank you. Fascinating stuff. Sean Bell there with the latest on the British Army and, of course, events in Ukraine.